Welcome and thank you for standing by. Currently, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted publicly. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I'd like to turn the call over to your host for today, Erlene Dowell.
Stacy. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the June Local Employment Dynamics, or LED, webinar. Before I introduce today's speaker, let's go over a few housekeeping rules. As mentioned earlier, this webinar is being recorded. For your convenience, it will be uploaded to our Census Academy site with all supplemental materials relating to the webinar within 30 business days. We welcome your questions during the webinar. Please submit your questions using the Q&A panel, which is located at the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen. Once you've found the Q&A panel, make sure you choose all panelists from the drop-down menu. This will ensure we see your questions. As time allows, we will answer your questions directly through the Q&A panel, or we will share your questions with the presenter to respond to during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Also, we ask that you do keep the questions pertaining to the webinar. We suggest keeping the chat panel open as we will provide key links and other resources throughout the webinar. Keep in mind, we won't be able to respond to the chat. That is for us to send out links and other resources related to the presentation. As you know, we are in a virtual environment and sometimes technical difficulties might occur. If you are having issues, try a different browser or consider logging out and coming back into the session. If you are having audio issues, try selecting the computer audio or calling into the webinar via phone. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the Local Employment Dynamics Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information, it is my pleasure to welcome Nathan Goldschlag as he presents Inventors and the Allocation of Talent. During this webinar, Nathan covers two groundbreaking research papers that reveal surprising trends by linking U.S. patent documents to Census Bureau microdata on people, jobs, and businesses. The first paper finds a significant share of inventors are foreign-born, have highly skewed earnings, and are less likely to start new businesses, while the second paper shows that from 2000 to 2016, more inventors were employed by large, established companies and tended to produce less impactful patents. Nathan Goldschlag is the Director of Research at the Economic Innovation Group, or EIG. He joined the organization from the U.S. Census Bureau's Center for Economic Studies, where he served as principal economist and led research on business dynamics, entrepreneurship, and the impact of technology on the economy. His academic work has examined topics ranging from the business dynamics of high-tech industries to effects of regulation and the adoption of advanced technologies such as AI and robotics. Nathan holds a PhD in economics from George Mason University. With that, I welcome Nathan.
All right, great. Thank you, Erlene. I'm super excited to be back at Census. I've been gone for 2 months, so happy to swing back around. And so here I'm going to be talking about research that was done while I was at Census, and we created some really novel data that I think we find a lot of interesting things in, and I'm really happy to share some of those basic facts about invention with everyone, and then also note that these data are available to approve projects through the FSRDCs. And so this is joint work with my co-author Ufuk Akshit, and as Erlene said, I'm the Director of Research at the Economic Innovation Group now. So this series of papers, this research agenda is sort of grounded in this puzzle between this growing gap between innovation inputs and innovation outputs. So in the most basic macroeconomic models that we write down, we tend to think if you spend more on innovation, then you should be getting TFP growth out of that. And so what we've seen in the time path of innovation inputs, which is here I'm showing you in the dashed line, which is a count of inventors per 100,000 employment, and then the time path of the changes in TFP growth, just after the financial crisis, as the count of inventors was going up, which is, you know, a rough proxy for innovation inputs, but you could do this same exercise with R&D expenditures. As we spend more on innovation, growth tends to be slowing down. And so this is creating sort of a gap in the inputs and then the outputs of how we think about economic growth and innovation and spending on innovation. And so what we're going to bring to the table is this idea that composition might matter. And so on the left here, I'm showing you the share of inventors that are employed by older, larger firms, which rose about 10 percentage points over this period from 2000 to 2016, from about 48% to just about 58% by the end of the period. And then on the right, I'm showing you the relative quality of patents of inventors at incumbent firms versus young firms. And so bars above 1 suggest higher values at incumbent firms, and bars below 1 suggest the opposite, patents that are more valuable coming out of young firms. And so you can see that incumbent firms tend to have slightly more applications, but fewer citations, which is a measure of quality of a patent. Fewer citations per application, slightly fewer independent claims. That's kind of a measure of the scope of the patent. And then much higher self-citation rate. And so self-citation rates are typically used as a measure to capture sort of how incremental an invention is. And so, you know, just with these two things side by side, it seems like it could be that the allocation of inventive effort across different types of firms might matter for the aggregate innovative outcomes. So in this work, we're going to be thinking about new ideas and products and processes as drivers of growth, but they don't come out of nowhere. It's fundamentally a function of people. People are a key input to innovation. And what we see in the data across there's a number of really interesting macroeconomic trends that I think are relevant and they're relevant for the way that we're thinking about the questions that we're bringing to the data about increasing concentration, declining dynamism, slowing productivity growth. But there's also things that we know from the literature that studies that suggest that different types of firms do different types of innovation. Innovation is not, the quality of innovation is not uniform across the firm age and firm size distribution. And so these things might interact in important and interesting ways. And so here, as Arlene said, I'm going to be drawing on 2 different papers. The first one is sort of a match and summarize. It describes how we created the data that I'm going to be showing you the results from today, and then sort of gives a bunch of first-order descriptive statistics of the inventor population in the United States. And the second does a sort of a deeper dive on this question of the allocation of inventive talent across different types of firms. Now, we're speaking to a large literature that is long in economics and innovation, that has long been interested in the characteristics of inventors and what inventors are doing. But it's only relatively recently that there's been large-scale administrative data sets to use when asking really complex questions about the innovation ecosystem. And so a lot of these studies were done outside the United States. Some of them used IRS data in the US. But one of the big things we're going to do here is introduce some new data, new linkages that can be used with US data, specifically all of the census data sets that capture person level information and link that to the patents. And so we're going to provide, as I said, a descriptive analysis of the inventor population in the US, and then again, talk a little bit about that allocation of inventive talent to incumbent firms. You'll have to indulge me to talk a little bit about the data and the matching, since this is something I'm super passionate about. So in the case of patent assignees and patent inventors, for those of you familiar with these types of data, you get relatively limited information about both the businesses and the people, just name, city, and state. And for those of you interested, that are familiar with the linkages to census data, this is not a lot of information. Typically, when you're matching businesses, you'll want preferably an EIN, but at least an exact street address, so you can kind of narrow down the matches. In the case of people, you'll want date of birth, preferably SSN, but you'll take date of birth, right, and other characteristics of the individual to sort of get that match right. And so our solution to deal with this problem is to collect all the potential matches for the businesses and for the individuals, and then use the jobs data to sort of clean that up and get the right IDs. The final output of this process is a crosswalk that gives you picks. So that's the person level identifier in the census data. the patent number, and the inventor sequence. Inventor sequence is sort of the order in which people occur on the patent. So it's a record on a patent document that we're putting a person identifier on. This paper was based on a match that ran through 2016, but the data that's available through the FSRDCs, I think, runs through 2022. We get a match rate of about 93%. And for this, again, for the data that we're using for this analysis through 2016, it's about 760,000 people, covering almost 4 million inventor records. So just to give sort of concrete idea of the matching exercise, and the reason I'm gonna stress this, the reason I'm doing this is I think this is a generalizable technology. I'll get back to that in a minute. But so this is what the patent document looked like. So this is the case of CRISPR. And so you can see here, this is the characteristics, the inventor information that's on the document. You get the name, the city, and the state. And so we're going to match that through a special version of the person validation system, the PVS, which allows us to get many picks, many individual matches for each record here, given the fact that we don't have that much identifying information. And then we're going to do the same thing on the businesses. So the assignees here, there happens to be 2 on this patent. You get the institution name, city, and state. And we're going to match that to the business register. And both of these matches, again, because we don't have much information, are going to give us a bunch of false positives. And so what we'll do is, if you take a given assignee and a given inventor, we're going to, maybe we get 4 matches to the business for the assignee, and we get 3 matches for the person through the PVS system. What we're going to do is we're going to get the job history for each of those individuals, and we're going to look for the firm identifiers that we got through the business register match. And what we'll see is, okay, in this case, person beta happened to have a job at firm A. And so we're going to see that and take that as evidence that beta is the right person identifier for this inventor record. And then A, cap A, is the right firm identifier for the assignee on this record. And so again, I want to stress this point that the reason I think it's worth, going through the guts of this a little bit is that we think this is a little bit of a general purpose technology. There might be lots of cases where people have relatively limited information on people and businesses that we think are going to have an employee-employer relationship in the LHD data. So what you can do when you have that situation is just this: do a rough match on both sides and then use the jobs data to clean it up. Okay, so what can we learn from these data? So obviously we get the demographic information from something like the decennial or the ACS, or the demographics that's embedded in the longitudinal employer household dynamics database, with the individual characteristics files. But basically you get a bunch of the individual characteristics and demographics of the inventors. You also get what's really novel in these data and isn't easy to come by in the innovation literature is earnings. Not only earnings, but also the characteristics of the employers. Both of those things we're going to be getting from a combination of the LHD and which is the longitudinal employer household database. That's the employee-employer linked data. And then the longitudinal business database, the LBD, that's the frame of employer businesses in the US. And so we're going to be able to take our inventor matches and figure out how much they earn, what's their job life cycle, and then what types of firms they're working for. And through a combination of the LHD and the LBD, we can also see entrepreneurship outcomes. So the likelihood that these individuals are creating new businesses. And importantly, dynamics over time. That's going to be a really interesting part of this analysis. Okay, so I'm going to start with some demographic information. So here I'm showing you the relative share of individuals by race in the inventor population to their share of the overall population. So bars above 1 mean that they're, quote unquote, overrepresented, meaning their share of the inventor population is higher than their share of the overall population. And bars below 1 mean the opposite. And so what you see here is sort of familiar patterns of underrepresentation of many minority groups, which has been found across a number of different studies. Typically, those studies are using algorithms that turn the names of individuals into a race and ethnicity characteristics. Here, again, we're using the census microdata with self-reported race and ethnicity coming off of things like the decennial census. And so there's a couple patterns here. One is that underrepresentation, but you can also see that the Asian group has a much higher share of the inventor population than they do of the overall population. It's about 3.5 times in the early part of the data, like 2000, and then it climbs over 4x in the later part of the data. And so to give some context to this, the Asian share of the overall population is something like 4 to 5%. And so their share of the inventor population starts at something like 12, a little over 12%, and rises to something like 21%. So Asians are a huge part of the inventor population. And the other really interesting thing we can do with these data is think about foreign-born individuals. And so here in the red line, I'm showing you the share of inventors that are foreign-born, which rises from just under 25% to 35% by the end of our sample period. And the other line on this chart is actually a citation-weighted version of the same share. And so the fact that the citation-weighted share is higher suggests that foreign-born individuals are on relatively higher cite patents, so they're on higher quality patents. Their share of overall citations rises from something like 30% to over 35% over this period. So, and I think the important baseline statistic to know is that the foreign-born share of the population is something like 17%. So the fact that something like 30% of the inventor population, they're overrepresented among the inventor population, which I think we already knew from a bunch of other studies. But again, these are like the definitive estimates from the administrative records and sources like the decennial census. The other really interesting thing we can do with the foreign-born population is look at the origin, the place of origin. And so we can take those foreign-born inventors and ask the distribution across broad geographic bins. And so that's what we're showing you here. In 2000, I've got in the black bars, and then 2016 in the gray. And so you can see that there's been a pretty large shift towards China and India as a share of the inventor population. The dot and the square are for the LHD, like just the full employment population. And so you can see China and India's representation among the population of inventors is much higher than their share of the overall population, and is climbing. Okay, so one of the other things, and we hinted at this a little bit when we were talking about the distribution of talent across different types of firms. And so we talked about the composition at older, larger firms, and this is sort of a complement to that. So it's the share of inventors that are working for young firms, which fell from something like 15% in early 2000 to below 8% by 2016. So this is a pretty significant drop. But of course, as we all know from the firm dynamics literature, there's been a secular decline in dynamism. And so over this period in the BDS, the share of total employment associated with young firms fell something like 14% to 11%. So it is true that this share is the overall share of employment of young firms is falling, but it's falling faster for inventors. And you might have hoped that inventors were somehow immune to this decline in dynamism, and you sort of get fewer but better startups and young firms. But that doesn't seem to be the case in these data. And so when you look at the share of inventors that are working at young firms, and you look specifically at what we call superstar inventors. These are inventors that are at the top 10th percentile of the cumulative within cohort citation distribution. So think of these are the inventors that are coming up with the most impactful patents. And you look and you take those superstars, you break them into 4 bins based on their impact, right? So 4 is the best of the best. Quartile 4 is the best of the best. And you look at the change in the share that are working for young firms early and then late. That's early is black, late in the data is gray. The biggest drop is among those most impactful inventors. And so we see a drop across the whole superstar distribution, but it's particularly large drop for the most impactful inventors. And so this is something that we talked about earlier. This is the share of inventors that are working at incumbent firms. And so this is just a chance for me to tell you what exactly that means. So these are firms that are at least 20 years old and have at least 1,000 employees. And this share has risen about 10 percentage points from 48% to 58% over this period. So there's been a large shift in economic activity and inventive activity towards these older, larger firms. And we were really keen to see if this trend, this movement of activity towards these older, larger firms goes back in time. And so our LHD data, which is the backbone of all these analyses, starts in about 2000. So in order to push this statistic back in time, what we did is we used the person and assignee business identifiers in the patents view data. It's a database coalesced by the USPTO. And in other parts of these papers, we show that the person identifiers are actually really good at disambiguating the records. But so we take those identifiers, the person and the business identifiers, and we ask what share of inventors are associated with large assignees. Now, these aren't necessarily comparable statistics because large is in the patents view data. We're just saying associated with lots of inventors through the documents themselves, right? So it's not really total employment. But when we do this, it's a rough measure. The dash line is the line from the previous graph, which is from the LHD data. And the black line is this analysis using the patent data. And so in using this definition of large assignees, it rises from something like 35% in the late 70s to over 45% by the end of the data. So it does seem like this is a long running trend. It's not just a post-2000, post.com boom bust situation. This has actually been going on for a long time. Okay, so again, thinking about the distribution of inventive activity by firm characteristics, what I'm showing you here is sort of a matrix that I'm turning into some lines. But basically, I'm asking by firm age and firm size, what is the impact of the patents associated with inventors employed by that type of firm? So each line represents a different firm size bin, from the darkest being the smallest to the lightest being the largest. So that's the firm size. That's the firm size dimension. And then the x-axis is firm age. So on the left is the young firms from 0 to 5 years old, all the way to the right is 21 plus years old. And there's a couple things that you can see in this. One is the obvious downward trend. So across age size groups, the impactfulness of the patents coming from the inventors at those firms is declining in firm age. And the other thing that you can see is that sort of the highest impact at the top left tends to be relatively large young firms. And so this isn't necessarily a surprise, given what we've learned from the literature about the characteristics of innovations at different types of firms. But this, again, I think underscores the importance of thinking about the allocation of inventive talent across different types of firms if those inventors at those different types of firms are doing different types of things. And so I hinted, and you were probably excited about this idea. I hinted that we were going to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship. And so here's what we have. So here I'm showing you the probability that inventors in a given year become entrepreneurs. And so for this, we're using a definition from the literature, looking at newfound firms in the LEHD and the LBD, and thinking about the people that are highly paid and they're on day one. And so the probability, and then we're going to turn that into a regression where the left-hand side is that 0-1 binary of whether or not an inventor becomes an entrepreneur. And then we're going to sweep out time invariant person characteristics with person fixed effects. And so what I'm showing you is changes in that probability from the base year of 2000. And so you might look at this and you say, well, those are really tiny coefficients. That's true, but the overall base rate in 2000 is actually quite low. So it's about 0.6% of inventors in 2000 became entrepreneurs. And so this negative coefficient at the end of almost a negative 0.3 is about a 44% decline. So there's been a significant decline in the probability that inventors are starting new businesses. And again, you might say, well, that's happening in the overall LHD, that's happening in the full labor, full employment economy. But you might have hoped that among this, hyper innovative subset of workers that they would buck this trend, and it doesn't appear that they do. Okay, so why do we care? Why do we care that inventors are not founding firms as often as they used to? It turns out that the inventor-founded firms tend to be the sort of up or out, high growth, high impact startups that we're most interested in the firm dynamics literature. And so here I'm showing you the age size profile of inventor-founded firms in blue and non-inventor-founded firms in red. And so you can see that, and these are all estimated differences in the size relative to their birth size. And so you can see that the inventor-founded firms have a steeper growth curve in their size profile, and they also end at a larger point. So the inventor-founded firms tend to grow faster and be larger. But the thing that this graph doesn't quite capture is the fact that the inventor-founded firms are also larger to begin with. The inventor-founded firms are about 40% larger on average at birth. And so you can kind of mentally, you can take that blue line and sort of shift it up to account for the fact that they're also start larger, and then they grow faster, and then they end larger. Okay, so one of the other interesting dimensions of these data is, and this is all just a giant sales pitch to get you into the FSRDCs and using these crosswalks, is the geographic dimension. So you can look at the distribution of inventors across fine geographies. And so here I'm showing you the share of inventors that are employed in the counties, the top 20 counties with the most inventors. So it's sort of a geographic concentration of inventors. That's the red line. And then as a comparison, I'm looking at the same measure, but for all employment from the business dynamics statistics, and that's the blue line. And so you can see that there's been a significant increase in the share of inventors that are working in those top 20 counties by inventor count, from 38% in 2001 to over 47% by the end of this period. Whereas you could look at that and you say, well, there might be that increasing concentration of employment across counties, but in the BDS it sort of hovers right around 21-22%. It's not changing that much. So there's significant increase in the geographic concentration of inventor employment. Okay, and so one of the other things that we can do with these data that is quite novel compared to other data sets that try to auto code the publicly available data sets based on names or whatever it is earnings. You can actually see how much these individuals are earning. And so what I'm showing you here is the percent of inventors that earn more than a given percentile of the overall earnings distribution. And so if you start at the bottom, about 92% of inventors earn more than the 60th percentile. And then if you think about like the top 10, it's about 63% of inventors earn more than the 90th percentile. And then if you go all the way up to the top, it's about 7.7% of inventors earning more than the 99th percentile. So it's sort of like almost an 8-to-1 ratio in the top. And then on the far column, I'm showing the same statistic, but for our superstar inventors. Again, these are the inventors that have the most impactful patents. This is even more skewed. And so you can see it's about almost 19%. Almost 19% of superstar inventors are in the top 1% of the overall earnings distribution. So inventor earnings is quite skewed. And some of the other analyses that we do that we show in the paper is that this is maybe unsurprisingly associated with inventive output. So inventors that have higher impact patents tend to earn more as well, which you would have expected. But again, sometimes it's nice to see those things play out in the data. Okay, so going back to the beginning, I promised something about composition. And so again, the setup here is we're thinking about a shift in activity towards these older, larger firms, and then these older, larger firms produce less impactful patents. So you could sort of do a back of the envelope calculation based on this, just assuming a 10-point shift and then the cross-sectional difference in the impact of the patents at those different types of firms. And so we do that in the paper, and you get something like, because as I said, older, larger firms tend to have slightly more patents. You get about a 1.7% increase in patents, but about a 2% decline in citations and a 4% decline in citations per grant. So you're getting slightly more patents, but they tend to be lower quality. So this is sort of to give a sense of the magnitude of the implications of this compositional shift. And you might look at that and you say like, well, there's a lot of issues with that statistic. There's a lot of endogeneity, there's life cycle effects. It could be that all the inventors, once they're ready to retire in place, they go and they work at a behemoth firm where they can hide in a cubicle and not have to work very hard. That could be happening. So it could be age life cycle composition. It could be sorting by productive inventors across different types of firms. But it can also be fundamentally just a difference in what different types of firms are incentivized to do. If incumbent firms have rents associated with existing technological regimes, which I'll come back to, it could be that they are incentivized to do different types of maybe more marginal innovations. Okay, so to answer this question a little more precisely, what we're going to do is do a hire event study. So we're going to look for twin hires, one hire by a young firm and then one hire by an incumbent firm. And we're going to try to match these up by when they were hired, the quarter of the hire, the age of the inventors, and then their pre-hire characteristics, sort of like their earnings trajectory before the hire event and their patenting activity before the hiring event. We want to basically find two very similar people. One gets hired by an incumbent, one gets hired by a young firm, and then ask in an event study framework, what happens to them? What happens to their earnings and their inventive output after the hire event? And so we're going to be doing this in terms of incumbent versus young firm. And so the estimates we're going to get tell you something like inventors hired by incumbents have this much more or less of whatever the outcome is. And when we do this, we find that inventors hired by incumbents tend to earn more, about 12% bump on earnings relative to those hired by young firms, and they produce less. And so this is we find about a 4% decline in patenting applications. And so we interpret this a little bit as sort of, from the lens of a gap between the social and the private returns. The private returns obviously being the individual's earnings, and the social returns being the amount of innovative output that they're generating. And so when we look at all of our other measures of innovative output, we see very consistent results. And so if you look at citations, you look at citation-weighted applications, inventors hired by incumbents have fewer citations, fewer independent claims, a higher self-citation rate, and then again, you can see the 12% bump on earnings in that post by incumbent. So this is sort of the DID version for all of our outcomes. And you might look at the self-citation rate, you say, well, older, larger firms tend to have a larger corpus. So even if you were citing patents in proportion to each firm's share of the corpus, you're just more likely to hit your own patents just because you're a large firm and you have a lot of patents. But when we've done some Monte Carlo simulations, some robustness exercises to do just that. Like, what if inventors cited patents just in proportion to each firm's share of the corpus? It's about an order of magnitude smaller than this. So we don't think that the self-citation rate is sort of mechanical, driven by the fact that older, larger firms have more patents. So in the paper, we write down an illustrative model just to kind of help us think about what these estimates are telling us. And in that model, we have it's a very highly stylized model where we have an incumbent and an entrant that has an inventor. The inventor has an idea, and that idea can displace the incumbent. That new technology can displace the incumbent firm. The incumbent has some rents associated with the existing technology, maybe because of learning by doing and the declining costs associated with the existing technological regime. And if the inventor and the incumbent match in the labor market, the incumbent has a choice. They can poach the inventor away from the entrant to forestall being displaced, or they could not. And so, when you do this and you write down some of the parameters of the model about sort of how good the idea is, if the idea is really bad, so the cost, or if the cost of implementing the idea is really low, then the incumbent poaches, implements the idea, which puts upward pressure on wages, and then also you see some boosts in innovation. If the idea is really expensive to implement, then the entrant won't bother entering, so there's no effect on wages and there's no effect on innovation. But if you're in that middle ground where it's expensive but not too expensive, then it won't overcome the incumbent's rents associated with the existing technological regime. So what they'll do is the incumbent will poach the inventor away from the entrant to avoid being displaced. To do that, they have to give them sufficient wages. So you see an increased pressure on wages, but then less innovation. So they're not introducing that innovation. So they'll poach the inventor to avoid getting displaced, and then not implement the idea. Okay, so stepping back again, I think one of the most important things we do in this paper is introducing these data to the research community, which again, we think are going to have a really big impact on our ability to understand the innovation ecosystem. And so what we're going to be providing is a pick patent number inventor sequence crosswalk that allows people to match patent documents to any census data that has the disambiguated identifiers on it. That includes decennial, ACS, the LHD data, and then through the LHD, you can link into the characteristics of the LBD. We give in this work, we give sort of the first order descriptive statistics of the inventor population in the United States. And these data, again, are available through the FSRDC system. In those descriptive statistics, we see sort of familiar patterns of underrepresentation, but I think most interestingly, we see this shift in the composition of inventive activity towards these older, larger firms, and then declining entrepreneurship as well. And when we try to interrogate that compositional shift and do the best we can to think about what happens to inventive output when they're hired by an incumbent versus a young firm, we find that earnings, when an inventor is hired by an incumbent, earnings goes up and innovative activity goes down. And again, we rationalize that with a highly stylized model, but that's just to kind of set expectations about how to think about these results. And I would be remiss if I didn't also bring up some other amazing work that I've done with my colleagues at the Center for Economic Study. And these are the business dynamics of statistics of patenting firms. And so the linkage infrastructure I described earlier, this sort of triangulation stuff, that was all done early on as an attempt to get to this, which is the stock and flow of firms, establishments, and employment at patenting firms. And so the triangulation stuff was super valuable because it also allowed us to link inventors, but ultimately we couldn't get back before 2000. And for this type of product, it's because the business dynamic statistics goes back to the late 70s. There was a very high premium on trying to match those earlier records. So a research team did a complementary linkage exercise just using the assignee names and addresses. And so you can find a link to that paper on this website. So this is a picture of the website. And so you can sort of see what we did there. We try to be pretty clever about like thinking about the longitudinal properties of different types of matches and that sort of thing. But this again is also a crosswalk that is available to researchers through the FSRDCs. And it's the backbone of this product. And so what we've done is we've flagged firms in each year based on whether or not they had a recent patent grant through those linkages. And then once we've classified firms, we produce the typical business dynamic statistics measures, which give you the stock and flow of, as I said, firms, establishments, and employment. So you can see sort of job creation and destruction by patenting firms and non-patenting firms. You can see the entrance, the age distribution of patenting firms, the size distribution, how that's changed over more than 40 years. It's a really powerful data set. And on the website, we've sort of teed up a couple different exercises just to kind of give a sense of what these data can show you. And so on the left here, you've got the share of firms of young firms. And so for all firms, that's the red line on the left, it's fallen from about 45% to about 35% from the late 70s through 2022 is the most recent year for these data. Among patenting firms, that share it bounces around a bit, but it stays roughly about 25%. And I think that's an interesting point that the share of patenting firms that are young is not changing nearly as much, or it's not showing the same dynamics as the rest of the economy. And on the right, I think one of the really valuable things in these data is that we're giving you both industry and technology information. So we classify firms based on the types of patents that they're being granted. And so these are using the CPC, Cooperative Patent Classification System. But anyway, they're technology codes. And so we classify firms based on whether or not they have a computer patent, a mechanical engineering patent, whatever it is. And so here I'm showing you the change in the share of firms, patenting firms with a computer patent. And so I think this is really interesting because across all sectors, from manufacturing through education, the share of share of firms with a computer patent is rising. So it's not just that these computer patents are only associated with information firms or in maybe manufacturing. It's sort of across all firms in the economy. You see this rise in computer patenting, which is a really unique thing that these data can tell you. And so if you just take the endpoints of that graph, this graph here on the right was indexed, sort of the changes. Obviously, the levels are very different. And so this graph sort of gives you the first and last point for each of those lines. And so, and you get the actual levels, right? Because that was all indexed, it's just changes. So here you can see that about 25% of firms in the information sector had a computer patent in the late, so 1978. And that rises to about 78%. So maybe that's not so surprising. But you could see across the board, which is the same pattern we saw on the previous graph. But I think it's interesting that the education sector is 61, makes 61, rises from like 26% to almost 56%, right? So across the board, there's been really interesting increase, even in wholesale, 9.9% to 28%. And again, there's a full set of tables across a bunch of different types of technologies up on the website. You can get it by firm age, firm size, sector, and state, and among other things. And this is at least lightly connected to everything I talked about today with Inventors. But you can also see with these data, publicly available tabulations, you can see the changing composition of patenting activity on the firm side. In addition to the microdata, if you get access to the FSRDCs on the person level. Okay, with that, again, I want to thank everybody for coming and listening. Super excited to be here talking about these data, and back at Census, sort of, after about 2 months.
Thank you, Nathan. Before we get to the questions, as a reminder, the presentation will be accessible on the Census Academy website at census.gov/academy under the webinar tab within 30 days. The link has been added to the chat. Again, please type all of your questions in the Q&A and keep your questions pertaining to the presentation. Okay, first question, what does TFP mean?
So it's total factor productivity. It's sort of our measure of the efficiency of the production process in the economy. That's like our core measure of how much we get out of the inputs of labor and capital expenditures. And so it's the primary target when we think about innovation. Innovations make us produce more with less. That's one way to think about it. But it's a measure that economists focus on as a way to think about, is the economy growing?
Is there a link to the rise in AI utilization and computer patents?
So there's going to be a subset of the patents that are associated with artificial intelligence. And I think the USPTO has a classification that they use. I think that one is based on the actual CPC code. So they try to say, oh, this looks like an AI patent. I'm pretty sure that's how it works. But there's also some other ones that my colleagues have done where they look at the descriptions and they try to match using like natural language processing to figure out what patents are associated with AI technologies. But I think that you'd have to be familiar with the life cycle of AI. The types of large language models that we have today, they're built on technology that was built decades and decades ago, and so those things probably do show up. But the flurry of AI activity actually happens a little bit later, right? And so our data ends in the business dynamics statistics ends in 2022, right? And so a lot of the kickoff in the type of AI patenting activity you'd be thinking about would actually be a little bit later. But some other colleagues of mine at CES have looked at AI startups, right? So you might be interested, branching off into another thing, another breadcrumb to give the questioner, is using the applications, the business applications, using natural language processing and looking at the descriptions to try to say, okay, is this an AI related startup, right? And so you can see, because these data are very, very timely, you can see the effects of the LLM boom in those data. And so I would encourage you to take a look at those data. It's AI patents from the business formation statistics.
Do you think these findings reveal anything about R&D as well?
Yeah, so I think I have a version of these slides that motivate it with R&D expenditures. And so you can see that R&D as a fraction of GDP has risen from, I think, something like 1.5% in 1950 to over 3% in recent years. So there's been a secular increase in R&D expenditures. One of the interesting things about that is that the share that's federal has declined precipitously for decades. But in any case, no matter how you cut it, it's the case that a larger fraction of our gross output is dedicated toward innovative activity. And at the same time, growth is actually slowing down.
Is the data you presented useful in policy for strengthening U.S. technology industry or manufacturing?
Is it useful for, I'm sorry?
Is the data you presented useful in policy for strengthening U.S. technology industry or manufacturing?
So of course, so I would say yes. From where I sit, of course, my work is very important. So if you're thinking about policies geared towards generating innovative activity, I think the lesson of this research is that the composition might matter. And so something we've known for a long time is that something like R&D subsidies skews towards older, larger firms as well. And so that, again, given what we know about the fact that different types of firms do different types of things, is going to have an implication for the types of innovations you get through those R&D subsidies. And very interestingly, the Census Bureau data, the survey data from the Business Research Innovation Development Survey, BRDIS, it's had like 5 different names over the years. It once was a SIRD. The primary NSF sponsored survey on research and development in recent years has questions about whether or not a firm has taken subsidies, has taken either state or federal subsidies. And when you look at those data and some complementary findings that we have, it tends to be older, some much larger firms. The probability that a firm is taking subsidies increases with size, right? And so, again, given the fact that different types of firms do different types of innovation, that's not going to be policy neutral, right? And so I think a lot of this is quite relevant. And I think the way I would phrase it is, again, composition matters.
What other demographics of inventors can you share with us? Age, sex, etc.?
So a lot of this stuff is in the paper. So sex and age are both in the paper. Sex, I think it's something like 12% of inventors are female. It's on video, so you'll be able to quote me, but don't quote me on it. It's rising, especially among young inventors. So the young inventor female share is quite a bit higher, but it's nowhere near parity between male and female. We also have age in there, and so age. It's true that the inventor population is aging, but it's also the overall employment population is aging as well. And so we show all of those findings in the paper as well.
When you take your EINS, PIKS to the jobs data, disambiguate, do you ever get more than one EIN PIK match? If so, how do you choose which one to take?
So the algorithms preference unique matches once you're doing that disambiguation at the EIN pick level. And because it's the algorithm you'll see in I think it's described in the appendix of the paper. You'll see that it goes through the different identifiers. I think it actually starts with firm ID and then tries EIN. So I think it actually starts with both. So the first is unique by firm ID and EIN, and then just firm ID, and then just EIN. But ultimately, the crosswalk you will see in the FSRDCs only has one match. So by the end of it, we're preferring unique matches. But it's of course the case that if you've got a very common name, John Doe, in a very big city, New York City, you're much more likely to get multiple matches. But remember, we also have a time dimension too, right? So we're not pooling the entire jobs database and sort of saying like, oh, did this person ever work there? The patent document has a time period associated with it, so we can whittle that down to just a small period around there, around the application date.
I'm going to give it a minute in case anyone else has a question. Okay, question. Do you have any next steps?
Yeah, so right now we're performing a similar exercise using data on scientists. And so there you have on a let's say a published paper, you have the person name and then the institution. And so it's a little bit, in one sense, it's easier than the inventors because inventors are mostly private sector. And so the names of those institutions are much more varied. In the papers, right, University of Michigan or whatever, there's only a certain number of universities, and there's also very helpfully something like the IPEDS data gives you other information about the universities, including EINs. And so we're going to be doing the same sort of exercise where we try to match the authors of published papers, and we're less interested in the actual institutions. I'm not, in this case, we're actually trying to get ABC core on the patent document. We're trying to get the right ID on that one. But in the case of scientists, we're just trying to get the person identifier associated with the author. And so I think there we're going to be releasing some new work relatively soon with those data. And I think it widens the lens. I think that's the way to think about this. Is the inventors, a lot of people complain about patent data because it's a relatively small share of innovative activity. It's mostly relevant for manufacturing and the information sector, and so not all inventions are not all inventions are patents, and not all patents are inventions, right? That sort of thing. And it's sort of like the thing that lots of innovation researchers use because it's readily available. But when we match something like the pool of scientists in like a large database, that widens the lens of people that are engaged in sort of basic research beyond the ones that are the things that actually end up in a patent document. And so I'm really excited about that, and it should be coming out relatively soon.
If composition matters, what steps can investors, companies, and startups do to diversify composition?
Well, I'd be thinking about this more from the policymaker's perspective, and thinking about like something like R&D subsidies and how that works across the size and age distribution. For investors, I think it's just recognizing that different types of firms do different types of things, and I think that people operating in this space sort of know that, right? Everybody's sort of looking through like for the unicorn startups, because that's where some of the most innovative ideas are coming from. Now, that's not to say that older, larger firms don't have very productive labs that do a lot of amazing work. So it's more of a story about averages than it is a universal rule. But there's important things that you can learn by thinking about the differences in the averages across those age and size distributions, and how that interacts with different types of policies that we have.
Thank you. That concludes our Q&A session. I'll now turn the mic over to Arlene.
Thank you, Tanja. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Nathan. That was wonderful. I had a lot of compliments in the background, so really appreciate your presentation. So I would just like, before we close out, would you like to make any closing remarks?
I'll just say I'm like really excited to have had the opportunity to do this. I think census data is a national treasure. The FSRDCs are a national treasure. The ability to see these things at the micro level, it opens up a lot of doors about what we can learn about the economy. Now, as somebody from the outside, I don't, I don't have a census disclaimer anymore. I can say I think it should be much easier for researchers to get access to these data, but at the same time, I will tell you that once you get access, it's well worth it.
Concludes the June LED webinar. Join us next month on July 9th when Keenan Fikri presents Persistently Poor, Left Behind, and Chronically Disconnected. I also want to invite you to our 2025 Local Employment Dynamics Partnership Hybrid Workshop on September 3rd through 4th from noon to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Our keynote speaker will be Sarah Bana, who will speak on labor market effects of generative AI evidence from software developers. Keep a lookout for more details. Upon exiting this webinar, you will receive a pop-up to an evaluation. We would appreciate that you take the time to answer the questions so we may better serve you with future webinars. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.